Caleb Rourke hadn't spoken a full sentence to another human being in 6 years. He'd buried his wife and daughter in the same frozen ground he now rode across, and he'd sworn never to care about anything except silence again. But when his horse refused to move in a whiteout blizzard, Caleb found 5 children abandoned in a snowdrift, one barely breathing, one holding a knife to his throat. And the man who left them to die was still out there. Some choices don't wait for a man to be ready. Before we begin, I invite you to stay with us until the very end of this story. If it moves you, please hit that like button and comment below with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's step into the storm. The wind came down from the Absaroka Range like the breath of something ancient and unforgiving. It stripped the warmth from a man's bones before he even knew he was cold. Caleb Rourke had learned to read that wind the way some men read scripture, with respect born of fear and a healthy understanding that it didn't care whether you lived or died. He pulled his collar higher and squinted against the snow driving horizontally across the valley floor. His horse, a steel-gray gelding named Ash, moved with the careful precision of an animal that knew mountain winters could kill as easily as bullets. They'd been riding since dawn, checking the northern fence line of what used to be called the Rourke Ranch and was now just a piece of land Caleb happened to live on. The distinction mattered to him, though he couldn't have explained why. 3 miles from the cabin, Ash stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Caleb shifted in the saddle, leather creaking in the silence between wind gusts. "Move on." The horse didn't move. "Ash?" Caleb's voice came out rougher than he intended. He wasn't used to speaking, even to the horse. "We got another hour of light. Maybe." Ash turned his head to the left, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Caleb followed the horse's line of sight and saw nothing but white, snow and sky blurred into a single colorless void. He was about to dig his heels in when he caught it. A shape, dark against the white, too regular to be natural. Caleb's hand moved to the Winchester in his saddle scabbard, a gesture so automatic he barely registered it. 6 years alone had taught him that anything unexpected was probably dangerous, and anything dangerous was best met with a loaded rifle. He urged Ash forward. The horse moved reluctantly, each step deliberate, as if testing the ground for traps. The shape resolved itself as they approached. A wagon, covered, tilted at an angle that suggested a broken axle or wheel. Snow had drifted against the windward side, nearly burying it. No horse in the traces. No tracks leading away that Caleb could see, though the storm would have covered them quickly. He dismounted, keeping the rifle ready. The snow came up past his knees. His boots punched through the crust with each step, and the cold seeped through the leather almost immediately. He dressed for riding, not waiting. "Anyone there?" His voice sounded strange in the muffled quiet. The wind had died for a moment, the way it sometimes did before coming back twice as hard. No answer. Caleb approached the wagon from the side, rifle up. The canvas cover had been tied down tight, but one corner had come loose and flapped weakly in the occasional gust. He grabbed the fabric and yanked it aside. 5 pairs of eyes stared back at him. Children. Caleb's rifle dipped. For a moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. Children. Out here. In this. The oldest was a girl, maybe 12, with dark hair plastered to her face and eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who should still be playing with dolls. She had positioned herself in front of the others, and in her right hand she held a knife. Just a kitchen blade, but she gripped it like she knew which end was which. "Stay back." Her voice shook, but the knife didn't. Caleb lowered the rifle completely, held up his free hand. "Easy, I'm not—" He stopped. "Not what? Not dangerous?" Everyone was dangerous out here. "I'm not going to hurt you." That's what he said. The girl's knuckles went white around the knife handle. Behind her, Caleb could make out 4 other children. A boy, maybe 10, with the kind of thin frame that spoke of too many missed meals. Twin girls who might have been 7 or 8, huddled together like they were trying to become one person. And in the very back, almost hidden beneath a pile of blankets that looked inadequate for a spring evening, let alone a Wyoming blizzard, a small shape that wasn't moving at all. "How long you been out here?" Caleb kept his voice level, the way he would when approaching a spooked horse. The girl didn't answer. Her eyes flicked past him to Ash. then to the empty white expanse beyond, looking for something. Or someone. "The storm's getting worse," Caleb said. "You'll freeze before morning." "We're fine." "You're not fine." Caleb gestured to the motionless bundle in the back. "That one alive?" Something cracked in the girl's expression, just for a second. Then she rebuilt the wall. "She's sick." "She needs a doctor." "There's no doctor out here." "There's a cabin, 3 miles south, warm, food." Caleb paused. "Medicine." The girl's jaw worked. She was trying to decide if he was lying, if the risk of trusting him was greater than the certainty of freezing to death. Caleb recognized the calculation. He'd made it himself once, in a different kind of storm. One of the twin girls started crying. Not loud, just a quiet, exhausted sound that seemed to hurt more than screaming would have. "Molly, hush." The older girl didn't take her eyes off Caleb. The boy beside her, thin frame, hollow cheeks, put a hand on the girl's shoulder. Lydia." His voice caught on the first letter, struggled over it. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up, Evan." "But Annie's—" "I said shut up." Caleb watched the exchange, read the desperation underneath the anger. The girl, Lydia, was terrified. Not of him specifically, of making the wrong choice, of being responsible for whatever came next. He knew that weight, had carried it himself. Still did. "I had a daughter," Caleb said quietly. The words came out before he could stop them. He hadn't spoken about Sarah in 6 years, hadn't said her name out loud. "She'd be about your age now." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "Where is she?" "Dead. 4 years back. Her and her mother both." Caleb met the girl's gaze. "So I know what it's like, trying to keep people alive when everything's working against you. And I know what it costs when you fail." The knife wavered. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Caleb continued. "I'm asking you to look at that little one in the back and decide if she's got 3 miles in her. Because I don't think she does." Lydia turned her head slightly, glanced at the motionless bundle. When she looked back at Caleb, her eyes were wet. "If you're lying," she said, "I'll kill you." "Fair enough." Caleb moved to the back of the wagon. The other children shrank away from him, except for one of the twins, the one who wasn't crying. She watched him with dark, steady eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of an owl he'd once seen, right before it killed a rabbit. "I'm going to pick her up," Caleb said to Lydia. "The sick one." Lydia nodded. Caleb set the rifle down, leaned into the wagon, and pulled back the blankets. The child underneath couldn't have been more than 4. Her face was flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. When he touched her forehead, the heat coming off her skin made him pull his hand back. "How long's she been like this?" 2 days, Lydia said. "Maybe 3. I lost track." Caleb scooped the little girl up. She weighed almost nothing. He could feel her ribs through the thin dress she wore. When he lifted her, her eyes fluttered open for a moment, gray eyes, unfocused, then closed again. "The rest of you, out of the wagon, now!" Lydia went first, knife still in hand. Evan followed, moving with a slight limp Caleb hadn't noticed before. The twins came last, the crying one clinging to her sister like a drowning person clings to driftwood. Caleb looked at the 4 children standing in the snow. None of them had proper winter gear, no coats thick enough for this weather, no boots that weren't already soaked through. Lydia's lips were blue. Evan's hands shook. "We're not all going to fit on one horse," Lydia said. "No." Caleb adjusted his grip on the fevered child. "So we're walking. 3 miles. You keep up or you die. Understand?" They understood. Caleb tied the sick girl, Annie he remembered, across Ash's saddle, securing her with rope so she wouldn't slide off. The horse stood patiently, accustomed to Caleb's silences and his occasional burdens. Then Caleb took Ash's reins in his left hand and started south. The children followed. The wind came back with a vengeance 20 minutes into the walk. It screamed down from the mountains, carrying snow that felt like broken glass against exposed skin. Caleb kept his head down and his eyes on the ground immediately in front of him. He knew this country, knew the slope of the land, the placement of the rocks, the way the creek bed curved just before it reached the valley floor. He could walk it blind if he had to. Which was good, because visibility dropped to almost nothing. Behind him, he could hear the children struggling. Someone fell, got up. fell again. He didn't turn around, couldn't. If he stopped moving, they'd all stop. And if they stopped in this, they'd never start again. "Keep moving," he called back. His voice was snatched away by the wind almost before it left his mouth. "Don't stop." He didn't know if they heard him. Time became meaningless. There was only the next step, and the next, and the next. Caleb's legs burned. His lungs ached from breathing air so cold it felt like inhaling knives. The rope in his hand had frozen, and his fingers had gone numb around it. Still he walked. Ash pressed against his right side, a solid, warm presence in the chaos. The horse's breath steamed in the air, mixing with the snow. Annie lay motionless across the saddle, and Caleb couldn't tell if she was still breathing. "Keep moving!" One of the children cried out. Caleb turned his head, saw a small, dark shape lying in the snow. One of the twins. She wasn't getting up. He stopped, handed Ash's reins to Lydia, who appeared beside him like a ghost. Her face was white, her eyes barely open against the wind. "Hold him!" Caleb went back, scooped up the fallen child. Molly, he thought. The one who'd been crying. She was unconscious. He carried her back to the horse, draped her across Ash's neck in front of Annie. The horse shifted under the extra weight but didn't protest. "Anyone else can't walk? Say so now!" Caleb's voice was barely a rasp. No one spoke. But when he started moving again, he noticed Evan was leaning heavily on Lydia, and the other twin was stumbling with every step. The cabin appeared like a miracle. One moment there was only white, and the next, a dark shape resolved itself against the storm. Caleb had built it himself 8 years ago, when he still believed in things like permanence and planning for a future. It wasn't much, just 4 rooms and a stone chimney, but it was solid, and it was shelter, and right now that was everything. He got the door open, ushered the children inside. Lydia helped Evan over the threshold. The twin who could still walk, the quiet one with the owl eyes, followed. Caleb carried Molly, then went back for Annie. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold. Caleb hadn't left a fire burning, hadn't expected to be bringing anyone home. He laid Annie on the floor near the hearth, then Molly beside her. In the dim light filtering through the windows, he could see just how bad they looked. Annie's fever flush had deepened to something that looked almost like a bruise. Molly's breathing was so shallow he had to put his hand on her chest to confirm she was still alive. "We need fire," Lydia said. She'd moved to stand beside him, still gripping that knife. "And water, and—" "I know." Caleb stood, went to the hearth. He kept kindling stacked beside it, always ready. Old habit. In 5 minutes, he had a flame going. In 10, a real fire. Heat began to seep into the room, chasing away the worst of the cold. "Blankets," Caleb said to Lydia. "Second room, chest at the foot of the bed. Bring all of them." She went without arguing. Evan sank into the chair by the window, his face gray with exhaustion. The quiet twin sat on the floor beside Molly, reached out and touched her sister's face with one finger. A careful, tentative gesture. Caleb knelt beside Annie. Up close, the fever was even worse than he'd thought. Her skin was dry as paper, her lips cracked and bleeding. When he lifted her eyelids, her pupils were dilated. He'd seen this before. In cattle, mostly. But once in a sheep herder who'd drunk bad water and died 3 days later, burning from the inside out. Lydia returned with the blankets. Together, they wrapped Annie and Molly, then piled more blankets on top. Caleb went to the kitchen, barely more than a corner with a stove and a shelf, and started heating water. While he waited for it to boil, he found his medicine kit. It wasn't much. Bandages, laudanum, some powders the doctor in town had sold him years ago, claiming they'd help with infection. The water boiled. Caleb poured it into a basin, carried it back to the hearth. He soaked a cloth, squeezed it out, placed it on Annie's forehead. She didn't respond. "What else?" Lydia asked. She'd positioned herself on Annie's other side, mirror to Caleb. "What else can we do?" "Wait," Caleb said. "Keep her cool. Try to get water in her if she wakes up." He paused. "Pray. If you're the praying type." "I'm not." "Me either." They sat in silence, watching a 4-year-old girl fight for her life. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire crackled. The other children had gathered close to the hearth, drawn by the heat. The quiet twin, Caleb thought her name was Noah, but he wasn't sure, had wrapped herself in a blanket and was watching everything with those unsettling eyes. Evan sat with his back against the wall, arms wrapped around his knees. He looked like he was trying to make himself as small as possible. "How long were you in that wagon?" Caleb asked. Lydia didn't look at him. 5 days. Maybe 6. Where were you headed? Nowhere. Running away. From what? Lydia's hand tightened on the wet cloth she was holding. A man named Gideon Vance. He said he had legal custody, said we belonged to him now. Caleb's jaw tightened. Belonged? After our parents died. Cholera took Ma in August, Pa in September. We didn't have any other family. Vance showed up with papers saying he was our legal guardian, said he'd take care of us. Lydia's voice went flat. He was going to sell us. The words landed like stones in still water. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest, separate from the temperature in the room. Sell you. To the mining camps up north, labor contracts. Evan and me for the mines, the little ones for... She stopped, didn't finish, didn't need to. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then, so you ran. Stole a wagon, stole a horse, but it broke loose 2 days ago. Been walking since then. Lydia looked at him directly. You think we did wrong? No. You think he'll come looking? Yes. Lydia nodded slowly. She'd known the answer before she asked. When? Soon as the storm breaks. Maybe before. Caleb stood, went to the window. Outside, the white was impenetrable. We'll deal with it when he gets here. How? Good question. Caleb had spent 6 years avoiding exactly this kind of complication. He'd chosen isolation specifically to avoid being responsible for anyone other than himself. And now he had 5 children in his cabin, one of them dying, and a man with legal papers coming to collect what he considered his property. The smart thing would be to turn them over, wash his hands of it, go back to his quiet, empty existence. Caleb looked at Annie, at Molly, at Evan, who couldn't meet anyone's eyes, at the twins, one crying softly and one watching with predator stillness, at Lydia, who held a knife like a weapon and refused to let herself be a child. He thought about his own daughter, about the promises he'd made and broken, about the life he'd chosen after she died, a life deliberately empty of exactly this kind of pain. I don't know yet, he said finally, but he's not taking you. Lydia studied his face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded once and turned back to Annie. The night crept forward. Annie's fever spiked. Caleb and Lydia took turns with the cold cloths, trying to bring the temperature down. Around midnight, Annie started seizing. Caleb held her down while her small body convulsed, while Lydia turned away because she couldn't watch anymore. When it stopped, Annie went completely still. Caleb pressed his fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse. For a terrible moment, he couldn't find it. Then, there, faint but steady. She's alive, he said. Lydia's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it looked painful. Dawn came gradually, the darkness lifting to reveal a world buried in white. The storm had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow and a silence so complete it felt like a living thing. Caleb stood at the window drinking coffee that tasted like charcoal and watching the sun climb over the eastern peaks. Behind him, the children slept, all except Lydia, who sat beside Annie with her knife in her lap and her eyes half open. You should rest, Caleb said. I'm fine. You're going to fall over. I said I'm fine. Caleb let it go. He understood stubbornness, recognized the refusal to show weakness when weakness could get you killed. Annie's fever had broken sometime before dawn. She was sleeping now, real sleep, not the unconscious stillness of before. Her breathing was deeper, her color better. Molly had woken up an hour ago, confused and weak but alive. The quiet twin, Noah, Caleb had confirmed her name, was curled up next to her sister like a cat. Evan still sat against the wall, watching everything with eyes that seemed to expect disaster at any moment. Caleb refilled his coffee, stood by the window, and waited for the next problem to arrive. It came just after noon. Caleb saw them first, 3 riders moving up the valley from the south. They were taking their time, letting their horses pick the path through the deep snow. Even from a distance, Caleb could read the confidence in their posture. These weren't men worried about what they'd find. Lydia, Caleb's voice was quiet, but it brought the girl to her feet immediately. Get the young ones into the back room. All of them. Don't come out unless I call for you. She understood, grabbed Evan, pulled him up, shook Noah awake. Between them, they carried Annie and Molly into the bedroom and shut the door. Caleb checked his rifle, loaded. He'd cleaned it 2 nights ago, kept it ready the way a man did when he lived alone and valued being alive. He set it beside the door within easy reach, then stepped out onto the porch. The riders were closer now, close enough that Caleb could make out details. The man in the lead was big, not tall, but wide, with the kind of bulk that came from good living and minimal work. He wore a coat that probably cost more than Caleb made in 6 months, and his horse had the kind of tack you saw on cavalry officers, all polished leather and bright metal. The 2 men flanking him were different, lean, hard-eyed. They wore their guns like tools, not decorations. The group stopped 20 feet from the porch. The big man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Rourke, I presume?" Caleb didn't answer, didn't move. The man's smile widened. "My name is Gideon Vance. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I don't believe I do." "5 children, wards of the territorial court assigned to my custody." Vance reached into his coat, produced a folded paper. "I have the legal documents right here." "Don't care." Vance's smile finally died. "I'm sorry?" "I said I don't care." Caleb kept his voice level. "Those children aren't going anywhere." "Mr. Rourke, I don't think you understand the situation. I have legal authority. You have a piece of paper. I have 5 children who'd rather freeze to death than go with you. That tells me everything I need to know about your authority." One of the hired guns shifted in his saddle. His hand moved closer to his revolver. Caleb tracked the movement without appearing to, calculated distances and draw times with the part of his brain that never stopped doing that kind of math. Vance's face darkened. "This doesn't have to be difficult." "Seems like it already is." "I could get the sheriff. Have you arrested for kidnapping?" "You could try." Vance stared at Caleb for a long moment. Then he turned his horse around. The hired guns followed. At the bottom of the porch steps, Vance stopped, looked back. "This isn't over, Mr. Rourke." "I know." Vance and his men rode away. Caleb watched until they disappeared over the southern ridge. Then he went back inside, where Lydia was standing by the bedroom door with her knife in her hand and murder in her eyes. "He's coming back," she said. "Yes." "With more men." "Probably." "What are we going to do?" Caleb looked at the closed bedroom door. Thought about the children on the other side. Thought about 6 years of careful isolation, deliberately chosen to avoid exactly this kind of responsibility. Thought about his daughter, who would have been 12 now, who would have looked at him with Lydia's same desperate hope. "We're going to fight," Caleb said. Lydia's grip on the knife relaxed slightly. "You mean that?" "I mean that." For the first time since he'd found her in the wagon, Lydia smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. Outside, the sun climbed toward its apex. The snow glittered like diamonds. And somewhere to the south, Gideon Vance was planning his next move. Caleb Rourke went to prepare for war. The afternoon light slanted through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the floor where the children sat in a semicircle around the fire. Caleb had given them bread and dried venison, watched them eat with the desperate efficiency of people who'd gone too long between meals. Now they waited, and the silence stretched tight as a bowstring. Caleb stood at the window, rifle propped against the wall beside him. He'd been thinking. 6 years of solitude had made him good at that, even if he wasn't always good at liking what his thoughts produced. "We need help," he said finally. Lydia looked up from where she sat with Annie's head in her lap. The little girl was still sleeping, but her color had improved. "What kind of help?" "Legal kind, the kind that makes Vance's papers worthless." Caleb turned from the window. "There's a man in town, Reverend Matthew Cole. He's got connections with the territorial administration. If anyone can fight custody papers, it's him." "You trust him?" "As much as I trust anyone." Lydia considered this. "How far is town?" 8 miles, 4 hours there and back in this snow." Caleb glanced at the children. "I can't leave you alone that long, not with Vance out there." "So what do we do?" Before Caleb could answer, Evan spoke up. His voice was quiet, each word carefully placed to avoid the stutter that lurked beneath. Could go? Everyone turned to look at him. He was still pressed against the wall, still trying to make himself small, but his eyes were steady. No, Lydia said immediately. I know the way. Been to town before. Evan's hands gripped his knees. I could make it. You can barely walk, Lydia snapped. Your leg... My leg is fine. It's not fine. You're limping. So? The siblings stared at each other across the room. Caleb watched the exchange with the detached interest of someone observing a card game he wasn't playing in. Lydia's protectiveness was obvious, almost painful in its intensity. But underneath Evan's quiet insistence, Caleb recognized something else. The need to be useful, to prove he wasn't just another burden to carry. Caleb knew that need. Had felt it himself once. Neither of you is going, Caleb said. I'll go at first light. We'll barricade the cabin, and you'll keep the rifle. Anyone comes up that path who isn't me, you shoot first and ask questions, never. Lydia opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She knew he was right. What about tonight? Noah asked. She'd been so quiet, Caleb had almost forgotten she was there. Now she fixed him with those owl eyes, unblinking. What if he comes tonight? Then we deal with it. How? Caleb picked up his rifle, checked the action. You ever see your daddy handle a gun? Noah shook her head. Your ma? Another shake. Well, I have. Been handling them since I was younger than you. Caleb set the rifle down again, softer this time. A man comes to my door meaning harm. He's going to leave in a condition that discourages repetition. Understand? Noah nodded slowly. Caleb wasn't sure she fully grasped what he was saying, but she seemed satisfied. The quiet twin, Molly had woken enough to confirm that Noah was her sister, stirred in her blankets. I'm hungry. It was the first thing she'd said since arriving. Her voice was small and hoarse, like something unused for a long time. Caleb went to the kitchen corner, started pulling down supplies. Flour, salt, lard. He'd been living on dried meat and hardtack for so long he'd almost forgotten how to cook anything else. But his wife had taught him, back when there was still a wife to teach him things. You know how to make biscuits? He asked Lydia. Some. Show me your hands. She held them out. They were raw, cracked and bleeding in places where the cold had split the skin open. Caleb cursed under his breath. Went to find the salve he kept for when Ash got cut on barbed wire. Put this on, then wrap them. He handed her strips of clean cloth. You're no good to anyone if your hands stop working. While Lydia tended to her injuries, Caleb mixed the biscuit dough. His hands remembered the motions even if his mind had tried to forget. Fold, press, fold again. The rhythm was almost meditative. Evan limped over, watched for a moment. Can I help? Caleb glanced at him. The boy's face was still gray, his posture still defensive, but there was something in his expression that reminded Caleb of himself at that age. The need to be part of something, to matter. You can cut them out, Caleb said, handing over a tin cup. Press straight down. Don't twist. Evan took the cup carefully, like it was something precious. His hands shook slightly as he pressed it into the dough, but he got the motion right. 6 biscuits. Caleb laid them in the Dutch oven, covered it, and set it over the coals. While they waited for the biscuits to bake, Caleb boiled water for coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute he usually drank. If there was ever a time to use the good stuff, having 5 unexpected children in his cabin during a territorial custody dispute probably qualified. The smell of baking bread filled the cabin. It was a smell Caleb hadn't experienced in years, and it hit him harder than he'd expected. For a moment, he was back in a different version of this cabin, when there were more rooms and more laughter, and the promise of tomorrow didn't feel like a threat. Mr. Rourke? He turned. Lydia had finished wrapping her hands. She stood with her arms crossed, that knife still tucked into her belt, and watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Just Caleb. Caleb, then. She paused. Why are you helping us? Already told you. You said you had a daughter. That's not a reason. Caleb poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed one to Lydia. She took it automatically, warming her bandaged hands on the metal. You're right, Caleb said. It's not. So what is? Caleb looked at the children scattered around his cabin. Evan, carefully cutting biscuits. Noah, watching everything with predator stillness. Molly, trying not to cry. Annie, sleeping the fragile sleep of someone who'd barely survived. And Lydia, standing in front of him with bruised lips and a kitchen knife and the weight of 4 lives on her 12-year-old shoulders. Because someone should, he said finally, and there's nobody else here but me. Lydia studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded, just once, and turned away. But Caleb thought he saw something in her expression soften, just slightly. The biscuits came out golden and steaming. Caleb split them open, watched the steam rise in small clouds. The children ate like they were afraid the food might disappear. Even Annie woke up long enough to eat half a biscuit soaked in milk before falling back asleep. After the meal, exhaustion caught up with them. Molly fell asleep mid-sentence. Noah curled up next to her sister without a word. Evan made it to the chair by the window before his eyes closed. Only Lydia stayed awake, sitting beside Annie with that knife in her lap and her back straight against the wall. "You should sleep," Caleb said. "I will. Later. Later you'll be too tired to be useful. I'm fine." They'd had this conversation before. Caleb recognized the stubbornness that came from being the oldest, the one responsible, the one who couldn't afford to show weakness. He'd been that person himself, once. Still was, in some ways. "I'll watch," Caleb said. "I don't sleep much anyway." "Why not?" "Bad dreams." Lydia looked at him, really looked, like she was trying to see past the surface to whatever lived underneath. "About your daughter?" "And her mother. What happened to them?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again, not as fierce as the blizzard, but constant and cold. The sound of it against the cabin walls was almost hypnotic. "Fever," he said finally. "Started in town, spread fast. By the time it reached here, there was nothing the doctor could do. Sarah, my daughter, she went first. Her mother followed 2 days later." "I'm sorry." "Me too." Lydia shifted against the wall, adjusting her grip on the knife. "That's why you live alone. Why the cabin's so empty?" "It's not a question, but Caleb answered anyway." "Yes." "You think we're going to die too. That's why you're helping, some kind of penance." Caleb turned to face her fully. "You think too much." "Somebody has to." Despite everything, Caleb almost smiled. Almost. "Go to sleep, Lydia. I'll wake you if anything happens." She hesitated. Then, finally, she set the knife down beside her and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Caleb stood alone in the firelight, listening to 5 children breathe, and tried to remember the last time his cabin had felt this full. The night passed without incident. Caleb kept watch from the window, rifle across his knees, and watched the moon track across the sky. Every hour, he checked on Annie. Her fever stayed down. Her breathing remained steady. Small mercies. Dawn came cold and clear. Caleb built up the fire, put coffee on to boil, and stood at the window watching the sun turn the snow-covered valley into something that looked almost peaceful. Lydia woke first. She sat up, immediately reaching for her knife, and only relaxed when she saw Caleb at the window. "Anything?" she asked. "Nothing." "That's bad?" "Why?" "Because Vance isn't the type to give up. If he's not here, he's planning something." Caleb had come to the same conclusion. Men like Vance didn't ride away from a confrontation unless they were regrouping for something bigger. "I'm going to town," Caleb said. "Today. Soon as everyone's awake and fed." "What if he comes while you're gone?" "Then you lock the door, keep the rifle close, and don't open up for anyone except me." Caleb turned from the window. "You know how to shoot?" "No?" "Then I'll teach you before I leave." The other children woke gradually. Molly sat up, rubbed her eyes, and looked around the cabin like she was surprised to find herself still alive. Noah was already awake, watching from beneath her blankets with those disconcerting eyes. Evan stirred last, wincing as he moved his bad leg. Caleb made breakfast. More biscuits. Fried salt pork. Coffee for him and Lydia, milk for the younger ones. They ate quickly, efficiently, and Caleb noted with satisfaction that Annie managed to stay awake long enough to eat a full biscuit. After breakfast, Caleb took Lydia outside. The cold hit immediately, sharp and clean. He led her around to the side of the cabin where he'd set up targets years ago, stumps at varying distances, each one marked with charcoal crosses. The rifle was a Winchester 73. Caleb had bought it in Cheyenne the year before Sarah was born, paid more than he could afford because he wanted something reliable. It had never let him down. This is the safety. He showed Lydia the mechanism. Off means ready to fire. On means safe. Never pointed at anything you don't intend to kill. Lydia nodded, taking it all in with the same fierce concentration she applied to everything else. Shoulder it here. Caleb adjusted her stance, noting how she winced when the stock pressed against her collarbone. It's going to kick. Don't fight it. Let your body absorb the impact. He showed her how to sight down the barrel, how to control her breathing, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. Then he stepped back. Closest stump. Take your time. Lydia settled the rifle against her shoulder, closed one eye, and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up snow 3 feet to the left of the target. The recoil drove her back a step, and Caleb saw her jaw tighten with frustration. Again. She fired 5 more times. The last shot hit the edge of the stump, sending splinters flying. Better, Caleb said, but in a real situation you won't have time for 6 shots. First one needs to count. How do I make it count? Practice. And willingness to do what needs doing. Caleb took the rifle back, reloaded it. If a man comes through that door meaning harm, you don't warn him. You don't ask questions. You shoot for center mass and you keep shooting until he stops moving. Understand? Lydia met his eyes. Yes. Say it. If someone comes through that door meaning harm, I shoot center mass and keep shooting until he stops moving. Good. They went back inside. Caleb packed supplies, dried meat, hardtack, a canteen of water. He checked his revolver, a Colt .45 that had been with him since the war, and slid it into the holster on his hip. The rifle went in the saddle scabbard. Ash was waiting by the small shelter Caleb had built for him behind the cabin. The horse whickered softly as Caleb approached, breath steaming in the cold air. Long ride today, friend, Caleb said, running his hand along Ash's neck. The horse's coat was thick with winter growth, warm under his palm. But it's important. He saddled quickly, movements automatic from years of repetition. When he led Ash around to the front of the cabin, the children were gathered on the porch. Even Annie had been brought out, bundled in blankets and held in Noah's thin arms. Remember what I told you, Caleb said to Lydia. Door stays locked. Rifle stays loaded. Anyone comes up that path, I shoot first and ask questions never. Good. Caleb mounted, settled into the saddle. I'll be back before dark. What if you're not? It was a fair question. Caleb looked at the 5 faces staring up at him, saw the fear they were all trying to hide. Then you wait until morning. If I'm not back by noon tomorrow, you take the children and head northeast. There's a settlement there about 15 miles. Trading post run by a woman named Maggie Fletcher. Tell her Caleb Rourke sent you, she'll help. Lydia nodded. She'd committed every word to memory. Caleb turned Ash toward town and rode. The journey took longer than he'd hoped. The snow was deep and treacherous, hiding rocks and deadfall that could break a horse's leg. Ash picked his way carefully, and Caleb let him set the pace. Rushing would only get them both killed. The sun climbed higher, offering light but little warmth. Caleb's breath frosted in the air. His hands ached even through his gloves. But he kept riding because 5 children were depending on him, and that was a weight he'd chosen to carry. Town appeared gradually. First a few scattered buildings, then more, until the main street materialized out of the white landscape like something conjured. Silver Creek wasn't much. Maybe 300 people on a good day, half that in winter when the passes closed and the miners went south. But it had a general store, a smithy, a saloon, and a church. Caleb tied Ash outside the church and knocked on the door. Reverend Matthew Cole answered on the 3rd knock. He was a small man, thin as a rail, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a beard that had gone completely white despite him being barely 50. When he saw Caleb, his eyebrows went up. Caleb Rourke, I thought you died up in those mountains. Not yet. Come in, you look half frozen. The church interior was simple. Wooden pews, a plain altar, no ostentation. Cole had always said that fancy decoration was for men who weren't sure if their message could stand on its own. I need help. Caleb said without preamble. Cole's expression shifted from surprise to concern. What kind of help? Caleb told him. About finding the children? About Vance and his custody papers? About the threat hanging over 5 lives that had already been through enough? When he finished, Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he went to his desk, pulled out paper and pen.
Gideon Vance, he said, writing. I've heard that name. He operates in the gray areas of the law, takes custody of orphans, indentures them to mining operations, and worse, he's careful to keep everything technically legal. Technically legal doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't. Cole looked up. But fighting him through proper channels will take time, weeks, maybe months. You have those children in your cabin right now.
What happens when he comes back with a sheriff and a warrant? I don't know. Cole set down his pen. There is one option, temporary emergency guardianship. If you can prove the children are in immediate danger, a territorial judge can transfer custody to you while the case is investigated. How do I prove danger? The fact that they nearly froze to death trying to escape him is a start. But you'll need documentation, statements from the children, medical evidence. Cole paused. And you'll need to be willing to stand before a judge and claim legal responsibility for 5 orphans. Caleb felt the weight of those words. Legal responsibility, it meant more than just shelter and food. It meant everything. I'll do it, he said. Cole nodded slowly. There's a territorial judge in Laramie, Randall Thorne. He's honest, which is rare. If anyone will listen, it's him. But Vance has connections, money, influence. This won't be easy. Nothing worth doing is. True enough. Cole started writing again. I'll draft the petition. We'll need a doctor to examine the children, verify the fever, the malnutrition, the signs of neglect. Is there anyone in town who could do that? Doc Harrison. He drinks. In the morning, maybe. In the afternoon, he's sober enough. Cole made another note. I'll talk to him. In the meantime, you need to keep those children safe. If Vance gets his hands on them before we can file this petition, we're finished. He won't. Cole looked at Caleb over his spectacles. You sound certain. I am. Caleb, I've known you since you moved here. You're a good man, a capable man. But Vance has hired guns, men who kill for money. If it comes to violence, it won't come to violence. You can't know that. Caleb stood. I know I'm not letting him take those children. However, that needs to happen. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. All right, give me 2 days to draft the paperwork. Then we ride to Laramie together. 2 days is a long time. It's the best I can do. Legal documents require precision. Caleb understood, even if he didn't like it. I'll be back day after tomorrow, noon. I'll be ready. Caleb turned to leave, then stopped. Matthew, thank you. Cole smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine. Thank me when it's over and those children are safe. Caleb left the church and headed for the general store. He needed supplies, food, medicine, ammunition. The store was run by a woman named Maggie Fletcher, the same one he'd told Lydia about. She was in her 60s, built like a barrel, with hands that could crack walnuts and a tongue that could strip paint. She looked up when Caleb entered. Well, I'll be damned. Caleb Rourke in the flesh. Thought maybe you'd finally done the sensible thing and died. Not yet, Maggie. Pity. I was planning on claiming that horse of yours. She set down the ledger she'd been working on. What brings you down from your mountain? Need supplies. Must be some need given you haven't been to town in, 2 years? 3. 3. Maggie shook her head. What do you need? Caleb listed items. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, lamp oil, bandages, laudanum, ammunition for the Winchester and the Colt. With each item, Maggie's eyebrows climbed higher. You planning on feeding an army? She asked. Something like that. Or maybe you got company up there. Maggie's eyes sharpened. What kind of company, Caleb? He could have lied. Should have, probably. But Maggie had a way of seeing through dishonesty that made lying to her feel pointless. 5 children, orphans, running from a man who wants to sell them. Maggie's hands stilled on the sack of flour she'd been lifting. Gideon Vance. It wasn't a question. You know him. Know of him. He tried to buy indenture contracts from me last year, for a boy who worked my stockroom. I told him what he could do with his contracts.
Maggie's expression hardened. Those children at your place, they safe? For now. What happens when Vance comes back? We deal with it. Maggie studied him for a long moment. Then she started pulling items off the shelves with decisive movements. I'm giving you double what you asked for. No charge for the extra. Maggie. Don't argue with me, Caleb Rourke. I'm old and mean and I do what I want. She stacked supplies on the counter.
You need help up there. You send word. I've got a shotgun and I know how to use it. Something in Caleb's chest loosened slightly. He hadn't realized how alone he'd felt until someone offered to stand with him. Thank you, he said. Thank me by keeping those children alive. Caleb loaded the supplies onto Ash, distributed the weight evenly. The horse turned his head to look at Caleb, as if questioning the sudden increase in burden. I know, Caleb said, but it's necessary. He mounted and turned toward home. The sun was past its apex now, sliding toward the western peaks. Caleb needed to be back before dark. The return journey was harder. The added weight slowed them down, and Caleb found himself constantly scanning the horizon for movement. Every shadow could be Vance's men. Every distant sound could be the beginning of an ambush. But they made it. As the sun touched the mountains, Caleb saw smoke rising from his chimney. The cabin appeared unchanged, and relief washed through him. He dismounted, knocked twice on the door. It's me, Caleb. The door opened immediately. Lydia stood there with the rifle in her hands, looking like she'd been holding it for hours. Any trouble? Caleb asked. None. Caleb unloaded the supplies, carried them inside. The children had arranged themselves around the fire again, and he noticed they'd swept the floor, washed the dishes, tried to make themselves useful in small ways. Annie was sitting up, not talking, but awake and alert. That was progress. Doc's coming tomorrow, Caleb said to Lydia while he unpacked. Need him to examine everyone, write down what he finds. It's for the legal papers. Will it help? Cole seems to think so. But you're not sure. Caleb set down a sack of flour, looked at her directly. I'm sure we're going to try every legitimate avenue available. And if those don't work, we'll try the illegitimate ones. Lydia almost smiled. Good. That night, they ate properly for the first time since the children had arrived. Caleb made stew, venison and potatoes and onions, thick and hot. The children ate until their stomachs couldn't hold anymore. Even Annie managed a full bowl. After dinner, Caleb distributed the new blankets Maggie had packed. Real wool, thick and warm. The children wrapped themselves up, and for the first time since arriving, they looked almost comfortable. Tell us about your daughter, Noah said suddenly. She was curled up next to Molly, both twins buried in the same blanket. What was she like? Caleb went still. He hadn't talked about Sarah in years, hadn't let himself think about her more than absolutely necessary. But then he looked at Noah's face, open and curious in the firelight, and at Molly beside her, and at Annie between them, and at Lydia and Evan watching from across the room. 5 children who'd lost their parents and were trying to build something from the wreckage. Her name was Sarah, Caleb said finally. She had her mother's eyes, green, like spring grass, and she laughed at everything, even things that weren't funny. He paused, surprised by how much it hurt and how good it felt simultaneously. She used to help me with the horses, would climb right up on Ash's back, no fear at all. Her mother said she'd be trouble when she grew up. Was she? Molly asked. Never got the chance to find out. The room went quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. I think she would have liked you, Caleb said softly. All of you. Lydia looked at him with something in her eyes that might have been understanding or gratitude, or both. The children fell asleep one by one. Caleb sat by the fire, watching them breathe, and tried to remember when he'd last felt like tomorrow might be worth surviving for. Dawn arrived with the sound of horses. Caleb was already awake, standing at the window with his coffee growing cold in his hand. He'd heard them coming for the last 10 minutes, the crunch of hooves in snow, the jingle of tack, the low voices of men who thought they were being quiet. 6 riders this time. Vance in the lead on that expensive horse, flanked by the same 2 hired guns from before. Behind them, 3 more men Caleb didn't recognize. One wore a badge that caught the early light. Caleb set down his coffee, picked up the Winchester. Lydia, he said quietly, Wake the others. Back room. Now. She was up immediately, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to respond to danger without hesitation. Within seconds, she had Evan and the twins moving. Annie went willingly into Noah's arms, still silent but watching everything with those fever-bright eyes. What about me? Lydia stood by the bedroom door, that kitchen knife in her hand. You stay close. If I tell you to run, you take them out the back window and you don't look back. I'm not leaving you. You will if I tell you to. They stared at each other for a moment. Then Lydia nodded once and slipped into the bedroom, leaving the door cracked so she could hear. Caleb stepped onto the porch as Vance's group reached the clearing. The morning was crystalline and cold, the kind of cold that made everything sharp-edged and unforgiving. His breath hung in the air like smoke. Vance reined in 20 feet away. The man with the badge, Sheriff William Hayes, Caleb recognized him now, moved up alongside. Mr. Rourke, Hayes said. His voice carried the weary authority of someone who'd been doing this job too long and had stopped caring about the why of it. I'm here on official business. That right? Hayes pulled a paper from his coat. I have a warrant for the immediate transfer of 5 minor children currently in your custody. Said children to be remanded to their legal guardian, Mr. Gideon Vance, as decreed by Territorial Judge Cornelius Blackwood. Caleb didn't look at the paper, kept his eyes on Hayes. Those children stay here. This isn't a negotiation, it's a legal order. Don't care. Hayes' jaw tightened. Mr. Rourke, I don't want trouble, but if you interfere with the execution of a lawful warrant, I'll have no choice but to arrest you. For what? Keeping children from being sold like cattle? For obstruction of justice. There's no justice in that paper, just words that make evil sound legal. Vance's smile was thin and cold. You see what I'm dealing with, Sheriff? The man's unstable, living alone up here for years, probably half mad. The children need proper care, proper supervision. I'm offering them that. You're offering them a prison sentence. Caleb's voice stayed level, but his grip on the rifle tightened. I know what you do, Vance. I know about the mining camps, the contracts that might as well be chains. Those are legal employment agreements. For children. Children you'd work until they broke or died, whichever came first. Hayes held up a hand. This is irrelevant. The court has made its decision. The law is clear. Then the law is wrong. For a moment, nobody moved. The hired gun's hands had drifted toward their weapons. Hayes looked tired and angry in equal measure. Vance watched everything with the calculating expression of a man used to getting what he wanted. Then a new voice cut through the tension. The law is also complicated, Sheriff. You might want to hear the rest before you do something you'll regret. Reverend Cole rode into the clearing on a bay mare that looked too small for even his slight frame. Behind him came Doc Harrison on a mule, and behind the doctor came Maggie Fletcher driving a buckboard with Walter Boone, a rancher whose land bordered Caleb's to the east, sitting beside her with a shotgun across his knees. Vance's expression darkened. This is a private matter. It stopped being private when you involved the sheriff, Cole said mildly. He dismounted, pulled a sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. I have here a petition for emergency guardianship, filed on behalf of Mr. Caleb Rourke, citing evidence of child endangerment and attempted trafficking. It's been countersigned by myself, Dr. Harrison, and 3 other witnesses. Hayes frowned. Let me see that. Cole handed over the papers. The sheriff read them slowly, his frown deepening with each page. This claims the children were abandoned in a blizzard, Hayes said, that they nearly died of exposure and fever, that Mr. Vance showed willful negligence in his duty as guardian. All true, Caleb said. You have proof? I have 5 children who can testify to what happened. I have a doctor who examined them yesterday and found evidence of malnutrition, exposure, and untreated illness. Caleb gestured to Doc Harrison, who nodded confirmation. And I have my own testimony about finding them in a wagon, in a snowstorm, with no adult supervision and 1 child burning with fever. Vance's hands clenched on his reins. This is absurd. I was delayed by the weather. I intended to return for them. You left 5 children in a wagon with a broken axle. No heat and no food, Cole interrupted. His voice was still mild, but there was steel underneath. The youngest was hours from death when Mr. Rourke found them. If that's your version of guardianship, I'd hate to see your version of neglect. Hayes looked from Cole to Vance to Caleb. This creates a conflict. I have a court order from Judge Blackwood, but you're claiming the circumstances that order was based on are fraudulent. Not fraudulent, Cole said. Just incomplete. Judge Blackwood didn't know about the abandonment, didn't know about the fever or the near death, didn't know that these children would rather risk freezing than stay with Mr. Vance. The children's preferences are irrelevant, Vance started. Are they? Maggie's voice carried across the clearing like a gunshot. She'd climbed down from the buckboard and now stood with her arms crossed. Because last I checked, even the territorial code says a child's welfare comes before a guardian's convenience, and those children look a damn sight more cared for now than they did in your custody. You have no standing in this matter, Vance snapped. I have eyes and a conscience. That's standing enough. Hayes held up both hands. Everyone calmed down. Cole, this petition, it would need to be reviewed by a judge, probably the same judge who issued the original custody order. Judge Blackwood is in Laramie, Cole said. 3 days' ride. In the meantime, the children remain where they are, under temporary protective custody. That's standard procedure in contested cases involving minors. That's not... Vance's composure was cracking. Sheriff, I have legal custody. The children belong to me. You can't just ignore a court order because some backwoods preacher filed paperwork. Hayes looked genuinely torn. He was a company man, comfortable with clear authority and uncomfortable with gray areas. This situation was nothing but gray. I need to see the children, he said finally. Talk to them. Get their side of things. Caleb's jaw tightened. They're not going anywhere with you. I'm not asking them to. I'm asking to speak with them here, with you present if you want, but I need to hear what they have to say. It was reasonable, more reasonable than Caleb had expected from a sheriff carrying Vance's warrant. He looked at Cole, who gave a small nod. All right, Caleb said, but the guns stay outside. Vance started to protest, but Hayes cut him off. Fair enough, Mr. Vance, you and your men wait here. The Reverend and Doctor can come inside as witnesses. The hired guns didn't like it. Caleb could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands stayed near their weapons. These were men paid to solve problems with violence, and being told to wait outside while their employer's plans unraveled didn't sit well. Walter Boone shifted on the buckboard seat, the shotgun moving casually to point more or less in the hired gun's direction. We'll keep these boys company, he said. His voice was friendly, but his eyes weren't. Make sure they don't get bored. Maggie climbed back onto the buckboard, produced a shotgun of her own from under the seat. Always did enjoy morning socializing. Caleb led Hayes, Cole, and Doc Harrison inside. The cabin felt smaller with 4 grown men in it. Warmer, too, the fire having burned down to coals that still gave off steady heat. Children, Caleb called toward the bedroom. You can come out. The door opened slowly. Lydia emerged first, knife still in hand, positioning herself between the men and her siblings. Evan came next, limping slightly, his stutter worse when he was nervous. The twins followed, Molly clinging to Noah, both of them wide-eyed. Annie was last, carried by Noah, her small face pressed against her sister's shoulder. Hayes removed his hat. I'm Sheriff Hayes. I need to ask you some questions. Lydia's grip on the knife tightened. We're not going with him. Nobody's asking you to. I just need to understand what happened. We already told Caleb. I need to hear it myself. Silence stretched between them. Then Lydia glanced at Caleb, and he gave her a small nod. She took a breath and started talking. She told Hayes everything. About Vance appearing after their parents died, claiming legal authority. About the contracts he wanted them to sign, the places he said they'd be going. About overhearing him tell someone the twins would fetch a good price at a certain house in Denver, that Annie was young enough to be trained however the buyer wanted. Her voice stayed steady through most of it, only cracked once when she described stealing the wagon and running, knowing Vance would come after them, but unable to stay another day. We thought we could make it to the coast, Evan added, struggling over the words. Ma had a sister in Oregon. We were going to find her. In a wagon in winter, Hayes said, across the Rockies. We didn't have another choice. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Annie, still silent in Noah's arms. Can she talk? Not since Ma died, Lydia said. Doc says there's nothing wrong with her voice. She just doesn't use it. Doc Harrison stepped forward. I examined all 5 yesterday. The youngest had a fever of 103 degrees when Mr. Rourke brought her in. Another few hours, she'd have been brain damaged or dead. The others showed signs of malnutrition, exposure, and in the boy's case, an old leg fracture that never set properly. Did Mr. Vance cause that fracture? Hayes asked. Evan shook his head. Fell off a fence 2 months before he came. Pa was going to take me to the doctor, but then he got sick. But Vance never got you medical attention after he took custody. Said it cost too much. Said I'd walk it off. Hayes made a note in a small book he'd pulled from his pocket. And the wagon you took, where did you get it? Stole it from his property, Lydia said. There was no apology in her voice. The horse, too, though the horse ran off 2 days in. So you committed theft. We committed survival. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. She stared back, unflinching, and Caleb felt something like pride stir in his chest. Mr. Vance claims he was detained by weather, Hayes said, that he intended to return for you, but the storm prevented it. He's lying, Lydia said flatly. He told us the night before we ran that he'd finalized the contracts, that we'd be leaving in 3 days.
He was celebrating, drinking. He wasn't detained by weather. He was letting us freeze because we weren't worth the effort of searching.
That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Hayes closed his notebook. I need to speak with Mr. Vance again, and I need to send a wire to Judge Blackwood. This situation is beyond my authority to resolve. So what happens to the children in the meantime? Cole asked. They stay here, under Mr. Rourke's supervision. But I'm posting a deputy in town to make sure nobody leaves the area until the judge makes a final determination. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Caleb nodded. Acceptable. Hayes put his hat back on. Mr. Rourke, I'll be honest with you. Judge Blackwood is old friends with Vance's family. They do business together. Even with everything these children have said, there's a chance the judge will rule in Vance's favor. Then we'll appeal to a higher court.
The next higher court is territorial. That could take months. We'll wait. Hayes studied Caleb's face. You're serious about this? About taking on 5 children you barely know? I'm serious about not letting them be sold. That's not the same as wanting to raise them. Caleb looked at the children gathered around him. At Lydia with her knife and her fierce protectiveness. At Evan trying to stand tall despite his trembling. At the twins holding each other like they were afraid the world would tear them apart. At Annie, still silent, watching everything with eyes that had seen too much. Maybe not, Caleb said, but it's a start. Hayes left with Cole and Doc Harrison. Through the window, Caleb watched them talk with Vance. The conversation was heated, Vance gesticulating angrily while Hayes remained impassive. Finally, Vance yanked his horse around and rode south, his hired guns following. The sheriff went with them, leaving the clearing to Maggie, Walter, and the morning sun. Maggie came to the door. We'll be heading back to town, but Walter's going to stay at his place. Keep an eye on the southern approach. Anyone comes up this way that looks like trouble, he'll ride over and let you know. Appreciate it. Don't appreciate it yet. This isn't over. Maggie's expression was grim. Vance has money and connections. He'll find another angle. Let him try. Maggie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You've changed, Caleb Rourke. Time was. You'd have avoided this kind of trouble. Time was. I had reasons to avoid it. And now? Caleb looked back at the children. Now I have reasons not to. Maggie had nodded slowly. Well, you need supplies or help, you send word. And Caleb? Watch your back. Men like Vance don't accept defeat gracefully. She climbed onto the buckboard and drove away, Walter following on his horse. The clearing fell quiet again, just Caleb and 5 children and the weight of everything that still hung unresolved between them. Is he really gone? Molly asked. Her voice was very small. For now. Will he come back? Probably. Molly started crying. Not the desperate sobbing from before, but quiet tears that seemed to come from somewhere too deep for sound. Noah wrapped her arms around her twin, and the 2 of them sank to the floor in a tangle of limbs and shared grief. Lydia turned away, but not before Caleb saw the tears on her face, too. Evan pressed his forehead against the wall.
and his shoulders shook. Even Annie's eyes were wet, though she still didn't make a sound. These children had been holding themselves together through sheer force of will, and now that the immediate danger had passed, the dam was breaking. Caleb stood in the middle of his cabin and watched 5 children fall apart, and he didn't know what to do. He'd lost the ability to comfort anyone when he'd buried his wife and daughter, had deliberately excised that part of himself because it hurt too much to keep it. But then Lydia looked at him with those red, desperate eyes, and something in his chest cracked open despite his best efforts to keep it sealed. He went to the children, awkwardly at first, then with growing certainty. He pulled Lydia into a rough embrace, felt her stiffen for a moment before she collapsed against him. Evan pressed against his other side. The twins wrapped themselves around his legs. Annie reached up from Noah's arms and touched his face with one small, warm hand. They stood there in the firelight, holding on to each other like drowning people, and Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. Like maybe, possibly, he wasn't completely alone anymore. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Caleb taught Evan how to care for Ash, showed him the right way to brush a horse's coat and check its hooves for stones. The boy was patient with the animal, his stutter disappearing when he talked to something that didn't judge him for it. Lydia took over cooking with a competence that surprised Caleb until he remembered she'd been running her family's household for months before their parents died. She made the supplies stretch in ways Caleb never could, turning dried meat and flour into meals that actually tasted like something. The twins were inseparable. Molly talked constantly, filling the silence with a running commentary on everything she saw. Noah barely talked at all, but her eyes tracked everything, and Caleb noticed she had a gift for appearing exactly where she was needed before anyone realized they needed her there. Annie remained silent, but she'd started following Caleb around the cabin, a small shadow that watched everything he did with those grave eyes. Sometimes she'd reach out and touch his hand, his sleeve, his boot, like she was making sure he was real. On the 3rd day, Caleb took them outside to teach them about the land. They walked the property line, and he showed them how to read tracks in the snow: deer, elk, mountain lion, wolf. He taught them which plants were edible and which would kill you, where the water ran cold and clean even in winter. "This is your home now," he told them, standing on a ridge overlooking the valley. "Long as you want it to be. Long as the courts let it be. You need to know it, need to understand it." "What if the judge says we have to go?" Lydia asked. "Then we appeal." "And if we lose the appeal?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines below them, creating a sound like the ocean. Sarah had always loved that sound, called it the mountains breathing. "Then we figure out what comes next," he said finally. "Together." That night, a storm rolled in from the north. Not as fierce as the blizzard that had first brought the children here, but steady and relentless. Snow fell for hours, piling up against the cabin walls, turning the world outside into an undifferentiated white. Caleb sat by the fire, working oil into his saddle leather. Across from him, Lydia was teaching Molly to read using an old Bible Caleb had forgotten he owned. Evan and Noah were playing some kind of game with stones and string. Annie sat between Caleb's boots, watching his hands move across the leather. "Mr. Rourke?" Molly looked up from the Bible. "What's this word?" "Righteousness." "What's it mean?" "Means doing what's right even when it's hard." Molly thought about this. "Like you, taking care of us when you didn't have to." "That's not righteousness. That's just not being a bastard." "Caleb," Lydia said warningly. "What? It's true. There are children present. Children who've been through worse than hearing a swear word." Lydia opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She was smiling slightly, and Caleb realized with some surprise that they were having a normal conversation. The kind families had. The kind he hadn't had since before the fever. The moment was broken by the sound of a horse outside. Caleb was on his feet immediately, rifle in hand. "Lydia, get them in the back room." But before she could move, a voice called from outside. "Caleb, it's Walter Boone, don't shoot!" Caleb opened the door. Walter stood in the snow, his horse behind him, both of them covered in white. The old rancher's face was grim. "Vance is back," Walter said. "Rode into town this afternoon with a federal marshal and a new court order. They're coming here tomorrow at dawn. Hayes sent me to warn you." Caleb's hands tightened on the rifle. "A federal marshal?" "Name's Daniel Whitaker. Hayes says he's legitimate, has papers signed by a territorial judge in Cheyenne. But Caleb, Walter paused. The papers aren't for the children. They're for Vance. Arrest warrants. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Say that again. Judge Randall Thorne in Cheyenne issued warrants for Gideon Vance. Charges include child trafficking, fraud, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy to violate territorial labor laws. Apparently, someone's been investigating him for months. They were just waiting for enough evidence. Who? Walter's grin was fierce. Your reverend friend. Cole's been writing letters to every judge, lawman, and territorial official he could think of. Finally got through to one who cared enough to look into it. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. And the children? Marshall wants to talk to them, get their testimony, but Hayes says Whitaker's one of the honest ones, says he won't let anything happen to them. I'll believe that when I see it. Fair enough. But Caleb, this is good news. If Vance goes down, those custody papers go with him. The children would be free and clear. It was good news, better than Caleb had dared hope for. But 6 years of expecting the worst had taught him to be skeptical of anything that seemed too fortunate. I want Cole here when the marshal comes, Caleb said. And you, and Maggie, if she's willing. We'll all be here. Walter left. Caleb locked the door behind him, set the bar across it, and turned to find all 5 children staring at him. What does it mean? Lydia asked. The warrants? Means Vance is in trouble, real trouble. Will they take him away? If the charges stick, and if they don't? Caleb met her eyes. Then we deal with that too. The night passed slowly. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat by the window with his rifle and watched the snow fall and thought about tomorrow. About a federal marshal who might be honest or might be bought. About warrants that could free 5 children or could be just another manipulation in a game Caleb didn't fully understand. Lydia stayed awake too, sitting beside him in the darkness. Neither of them spoke. There wasn't much to say. They'd done everything they could. Now they had to wait and see if it was enough. Dawn came gray and cold. Caleb made coffee, strong enough to strip paint, and stood on the porch watching the southern approach. Right on time, riders appeared. Hayes in the lead, then a man Caleb didn't know wearing a marshal's badge. Behind them came Cole, Maggie, and Walter. No sign of Vance. The marshal was younger than Caleb expected. Maybe 30, with sharp eyes and a careful way of moving that spoke of someone who'd learned to be cautious. He dismounted, approached the porch alone. Mr. Rourke, I'm Marshal Daniel Whitaker. I'd like to speak with you and the children in your custody. You alone? Sheriff Hayes is with me. The others are witnesses. Where's Vance? Whitaker's expression hardened. In custody. Arrested 2 hours ago on 16 counts of child trafficking and related charges. He'll stand trial in Cheyenne next month. The words landed like a physical blow. Caleb actually took a step back. He's arrested? Right now? Right now. Along with Judge Cornelius Blackwood, who we've discovered accepted substantial bribes to issue fraudulent custody orders, and 3 territorial officials who helped Vance move children across state lines. Caleb's knees felt weak. He gripped the porch railing to steady himself. The children, he managed. What happens to them? That's why I'm here. I need their testimony about what Vance did, what he planned to do. And I need to verify they're safe and cared for. Whitaker paused. Mr. Rourke, I've read Reverend Cole's petition for emergency guardianship. If the children confirm what's in there, and if you're still willing to accept responsibility for them, I'm prepared to grant temporary federal custody pending a full review. How long is temporary? 30 days. After that, you'll need to file for permanent guardianship through proper channels. But given the circumstances, I don't anticipate any problems. It was everything Caleb had hoped for, and more. He should have felt relieved, triumphant even. Instead, he felt the weight of 5 lives settling onto his shoulders with a permanence that made it hard to breathe. I'll get the children, he said. The interviews took most of the morning. Marshal Whitaker spoke with each child separately in the bedroom, while Caleb waited outside with Cole and the others. Through the thin walls, Caleb could hear voices, Lydia's steady recitation of facts, Evan's halting testimony punctuated by long silences, Molly's answers interrupted by tears she tried to suppress. When it was Annie's turn, Caleb stood. She doesn't talk. Whitaker looked up from his notes. At all? Not since her mother died. Doc Harrison says there's no physical reason. It's something else. I still need to try. Caleb nodded reluctantly and watched Annie disappear into the bedroom, her small hand gripping Noah's. The door closed, and silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Caleb paced to the window, stared out at nothing, tried not to imagine what questions were being asked in there. When the door finally opened, Annie emerged first. Her face was pale but composed, and she walked straight to Caleb and pressed herself against his leg. He put his hand on her head, felt the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her dress. Whitaker came out looking troubled. She communicated through gestures and her sister's translations. It was enough. He glanced at Annie with something that might have been pity or might have been anger at what had been done to her. More than enough. Hayes cleared his throat. So what's the verdict, Marshal? Whitaker closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Mr. Vance's custody claim is void. The court order that granted it was issued under false pretenses by a corrupt official. As of this moment, these children have no legal guardian. Caleb's throat tightened. And I'm hereby placing them in the temporary protective custody of Caleb Rourke, pending formal guardianship proceedings. Whitaker pulled out a document already signed and sealed. This gives you legal authority for 30 days. During that time, you'll need to file with the territorial court for permanent guardianship. Given what I've seen here, I don't anticipate any objections. The paper felt heavy in Caleb's hands, heavier than it should have been for just ink and parchment. What do I need to do? He asked. Provide for them. Keep them safe. Show you're capable of raising 5 children. Whitaker's expression softened slightly. From what Reverend Cole tells me, you've already been doing that. For less than 2 weeks. Some men couldn't manage it for 2 hours. Whitaker extended his hand. You're doing right by these children, Mr. Rourke. That's all anyone can ask. Caleb shook the marshal's hand, feeling the roughness of calluses that spoke of a man who'd worked with his hands before he pinned on a badge. Honest calluses. Maybe Cole had been right about Whitaker being one of the good ones. After the marshal and Hayes left, Cole remained behind. The Reverend accepted coffee and sat by the fire while the children gathered around, sensing that something important had happened, but not quite understanding what. So it's done? Lydia asked. We can stay? For now, Caleb said. 30 days to prove I can handle this, then we go before a judge. And if the judge says no? Then we figure out what comes next. Caleb looked at Cole. What are the chances the court will approve permanent guardianship? Cole considered the question carefully. Honestly? Better than you might think. You're a landowner with a stable home. You have community support, Maggie, Walter, myself, Doc Harrison. The children clearly want to stay with you, and you've already demonstrated you can provide adequate care. He paused. But there are complications. Such as? You're a single man. The courts generally prefer couples for raising children, particularly young girls. Cole glanced at the twins, at Annie. There will be questions about propriety, about whether it's appropriate for you to be sole guardian. That's horseshit, Maggie said from where she stood by the door. She'd been quiet until now, but her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 60 years not caring what people thought. Caleb's a better parent than half the married couples I know. I'm not disagreeing with you, Maggie. I'm telling you what the court will say. So what do we do? Caleb asked. We prepare. Document everything. Show you have a plan for their education, their moral development, their future prospects. Get character witnesses. Make it impossible for any reasonable judge to say no. Cole set down his coffee cup. And Caleb? You need to be honest with yourself about whether you're ready for this. Not just for 30 days, but for the next 10, 15 years. Until the youngest is grown and gone. Caleb looked at the 5 faces watching him. Lydia with her fierce protectiveness and 2 old eyes. Evan with his stutter and his careful hope. Noah with her silent observations and uncanny awareness. Molly with her need for comfort and her fragile trust. Annie, who hadn't spoken in months but communicated more with her silence than most people did with words. Was he ready for this? No. He'd never be ready. You couldn't be ready for something that fundamentally altered the shape of your entire existence. But ready or not, here they were. I'll do whatever's necessary, Caleb said. Cole smiled. I know you will. That's why I think this might actually work. After Cole left, the cabin felt both larger and smaller than before. Larger because it now held the weight of official recognition, of legal responsibility. Smaller because Caleb was acutely aware of how inadequate his 4 rooms were for a family of 6. "We need more space," he said, almost to himself. Lydia looked up from where she was mending one of Molly's dresses. "What?" "Space. Rooms. You can't all keep sleeping in one bedroom. We've managed fine." "Fine isn't good enough. Not if we're going to convince a judge this is a proper home." Caleb moved to the window, looked out at the property. "There's enough lumber in the shed to add on. Maybe 2 more rooms, one for you girls, one for Evan." "You know how to build?" "Built this cabin, didn't I?" "In how long?" 2 years, but I was alone then. Had time to be particular." Caleb turned back to face them. "With help, we could have the framing done in a month, walls and roof before winter comes back." Evan stood up, his bad leg making him wobble slightly. "I could help." "You ever done carpentry?" No, but I can learn." Caleb studied the boy. Evan was thin, underfed, with a limp that would probably never fully heal. But there was determination in his eyes, a hunger to prove himself useful that Caleb recognized from his own youth. "All right," Caleb said. "We start tomorrow. But first, you need to eat more. Can't swing a hammer if you don't have the strength to lift it." Something lit up in Evan's face. Not quite a smile, but close. Yes, sir." That night, Caleb sat at the table with paper and pencil, sketching plans for the addition. He wasn't much of an artist, but he could render basic dimensions and load-bearing calculations. 2 rooms, 12 by 12 each, connected to the main cabin by a short hallway, a window in each room for light and air. Lydia came to stand beside him, looking over his shoulder. "That's a lot of work." "Yes." "For children, you barely know." Caleb set down the pencil. "I know you well enough." "Do you?" Lydia pulled out a chair, sat down across from him. "What do you know about me, Caleb Rourke?" It was the first time she'd used his first name without the Mr. attached. Caleb noted it, but didn't comment. "I know you're 12 years old and you've been carrying the weight of 4 lives for longer than you should have," he said. "I know you'd kill to protect your siblings. I know you don't trust easy, and you probably never will, because people have given you every reason not to. I know you're smarter than most adults I've met, and tougher than soldiers I fought beside in the war." Lydia's expression didn't change, but her hands loosened slightly where they gripped the edge of the table. "What else?" she asked. "I know you're tired, bone tired, the kind that comes from months of being afraid and responsible and never getting to just be a child." Caleb met her eyes. "And I know you're sitting across from me right now trying to decide if this is real. If I'm real, or if it's just another thing that's going to fall apart and leave you worse off than before." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. The fire popped and settled. "How do you know that?" she asked finally. "Because I felt the same way after my wife died. Kept waiting for the next bad thing. Stopped trusting that anything good could last." Caleb reached across the table, tapped the sketches. "This is me trying to trust again, trying to build something that won't fall apart. What if it does anyway? Then at least we tried." Lydia studied the sketches, traced the outline of one room with her finger. "I've never had my own room, always shared with Annie and the twins. You'll still share, but you'll have space, privacy when you need it. And if the judge says we can't stay, what happens to the rooms then? They'll be here, for whoever needs them." Lydia looked at him with an expression that was too old for her young face. "You're a strange man, Caleb Rourke. I've been called worse." This time she did smile. Small and tentative, but genuine. Work on the addition began the next morning. Caleb and Evan cleared snow from the building site, marked out dimensions with stakes and string. The ground was frozen solid, which meant they'd have to wait for spring to dig proper foundations, but Caleb could at least get the framing started. Evan worked with quiet intensity, never complaining even when Caleb could see the cold making his bad leg worse. The boy had a natural aptitude for spatial reasoning, understanding load distribution and angle calculations without needing much explanation. "Your father teach you any of this?" Caleb asked while they measured lumber. No, Pa was a shopkeeper, sold to dry goods. Evan positioned the measuring tape. But I like how it makes sense. You cut here, join there, and something exists that didn't before. That's carpentry in a nutshell. They worked until the light began to fail. By the time they quit, they'd cut enough lumber for the basic frame and laid out the floor joists. Not bad for a first day. Inside, the cabin smelled like the stew Lydia had made. Venison and root vegetables, thickened with flour, and seasoned with herbs she'd found in Caleb's neglected pantry. The girls had set this table, a task that had somehow transformed into an elaborate production involving a tablecloth Lydia had sewn from flour sacks and wildflowers Molly had dried last summer. They ate together, crowded around a table meant for 2 people at most. Elbows bumped. Someone spilled milk. Noah stole bites from Molly's plate when she thought no one was looking. Annie fell asleep with her head on the table halfway through the meal. It was chaotic and noisy, and nothing like the silent dinners Caleb had eaten alone for 6 years. It was also, he realized with something like wonder, what family felt like. After dinner, while Lydia cleaned up and the twins played some complicated game involving string and singing, Evan approached Caleb. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why did you stop living after your F family died? Caleb had been oiling his boots. He stopped, the rag frozen in his hand. What makes you think I stopped living? This cabin, it's just basic, nothing extra, nothing that doesn't serve a purpose. Evan gestured around the sparse room. It's like you were just waiting, not living. The boy was more perceptive than Caleb had given him credit for. Maybe I was, Caleb said finally, waiting for something to make it worth the effort again. And then now? Caleb looked at the children scattered around his cabin, at Lydia teaching Molly to read, at Noah watching everything with those uncanny eyes, at Annie sleeping in a nest of blankets by the fire, at Evan himself, standing there with honest curiosity on his young face. Now I've got reasons to stop waiting, Caleb said. Evan nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. Good. Because we need you. And not just for food and shelter. We need you to show us how to keep going when everything's broken. I'm not sure I'm qualified for that. You're still here. That makes you qualified. The simple logic was irrefutable. Caleb found himself smiling despite the heaviness in his chest. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we've got more lumber to cut. Yes, sir. The days developed a rhythm that was both foreign and familiar. Caleb and Evan worked on the addition every morning, making slow but steady progress. The frame took shape, ribs of fresh-cut timber standing pale against the weathered logs of the original cabin. Lydia managed the household with efficient precision, transforming Caleb's bachelor chaos into something approaching order. The twins helped where they could, though their help was often more hindrance than assistance. Annie followed Caleb like a shadow, watching everything, saying nothing. 2 weeks into the 30-day probationary period, Walter Boone rode up with news. Judge scheduled your guardianship hearing, 3 weeks from now in Laramie. Caleb set down the hammer he'd been using. That's fast. Marshal Whitaker pushed for it, said there was no reason to drag it out. Walter dismounted, examined the addition's framing with an approving eye. Coming along nice. You'll have it enclosed before the hearing. That's the plan. Good. Judge will want to see you've made a stable home. This'll help. Walter pulled an envelope from his coat. Also, Cole asked me to bring this. Character references from folks in town. Might want to read through them before you go before the judge. Caleb took the envelope, felt the thickness of multiple pages inside. How many people wrote? 15, last I heard. Would have been more, but Cole wanted quality over quantity. 15 people. Caleb had lived near Silver Creek for 8 years, but the last 6 he'd made a point of avoiding human contact. The idea that 15 people would vouch for him felt surreal. That night he read the letters by firelight while the children slept. They came from people he'd helped years ago and people he'd barely spoken to. Maggie's was characteristically blunt, stating that Caleb Rourke was stubborn, antisocial, and thoroughly decent despite his best efforts to hide it. Doc Harrison's focused on Caleb's character during the fever outbreak that killed his family, how he'd refused help for himself while making sure others got supplies they needed. The last letter was from a woman named Sarah Chen who ran the Chinese laundry on the edge of town. Caleb barely remembered her, but apparently he'd helped fix her roof after a bad storm 5 years back and refused payment. Her English was broken, but the sentiment was clear. Caleb Rourke was a good man who deserved good things. Caleb folded the letters carefully and sat staring into the fire, trying to reconcile the man described in those pages with the hollow shell he'd become, trying to believe that maybe, possibly, he could be that person again. "You're thinking too loud." He looked up. Lydia stood in the bedroom doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "Can't sleep?" Caleb asked. "Can you?" "Not much these days." Lydia came to sit by the fire. "What's in the letters?" "People saying nice things they probably don't mean. Why would they lie?" "Not lying, just seeing me how I used to be instead of how I am."
Maybe you're seeing yourself how you used to be instead of how you are now." Caleb glanced at her. "When did you get so philosophical?" "When I had to grow up faster than I should have." Lydia pulled the blanket tighter. "You're different than when you found us. Less alone. Less angry." "I wasn't angry. You were furious at the world, at yourself, at whatever took your family." Lydia poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up. "You've just been hiding it under all that silence." She wasn't wrong. Caleb had been angry for 6 years, a low constant burn that colored everything he did. But somewhere in the last few weeks, that anger had transformed into something else. Not gone exactly, but redirected into something that felt almost like purpose. "What about you?" Caleb asked. "You angry?" "Every day." "At Vance?" "At everyone who didn't help when they should have. At Ma and Pa for dying. At the world for being cruel." Lydia's hands tightened on the blanket. "At myself for not being strong enough to fix it." "You kept your siblings alive through a Wyoming winter in a broken wagon. You're plenty strong." "I almost got us killed." "But you didn't. You got them here, to safety." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. "What if I can't keep them safe? What if something happens and I'm not strong enough? Then I'll be strong for you. That's what family does." "We're not family." "Not really. You're just doing this because you feel guilty about your daughter." The words were harsh, but Caleb heard the fear underneath them. Lydia was testing him, pushing to see if he'd break and prove her worst assumptions right. "I did feel guilty," Caleb said. "Still do, sometimes. But that's not why I'm doing this." "Then why?" "Because you need someone, and I need to be needed." Caleb met her eyes. "Because 5 children showed up in my life when I'd given up on having one worth living. And maybe we can fix each other, or maybe we'll just survive together. Either way, it's better than being alone." Lydia stared at him, then slowly her expression crumpled. Not crying exactly, but something breaking open that had been held too tight for too long. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know. What if the judge says we can't stay? Then we'll figure something out. What if you change your mind? What if you wake up one day and realize this is too hard?" Caleb reached across the space between them, put his hand on her shoulder. "Lydia, I've been living in a cabin alone for 6 years because I was too scared to feel anything. These last few weeks have been the hardest thing I've done since I buried my family. They've also been the only thing that's made me feel alive." He squeezed gently. "I'm not changing my mind." "Promise?" "Promise." Lydia took a shaky breath, then leaned against his shoulder. They sat there by the fire, watching the flames dance, and Caleb felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, exactly, but the absence of the terrible emptiness that had defined his existence for so long. The next week passed in a blur of work. The addition's walls went up, rough-hewn logs notched and fitted with the precision Caleb had learned building the original cabin. Evan proved surprisingly adept at chinking, the process of filling gaps between logs with mud and moss, working with patient attention to detail that reminded Caleb of himself at that age. Lydia had taken over teaching the younger children, using the Bible and an old primer Maggie had brought from town. Molly was learning to read with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. Noah already knew how, but pretended otherwise, so she could sit with her sister.
Annie watched the lessons intently, following along in her silent way. And once Caleb saw her mouth forming words even though no sound came out. 3 days before the hearing, Doc Harrison rode up to do a final examination. He checked each child thoroughly, noting their weight gain, the improvement in Evan's limp, the complete absence of fever in Annie. When he finished, he pulled Caleb aside. "They're thriving," Harrison said. "All of them.
In 3 weeks, you've done what most parents can't manage in 3 months. I've had help. Help doesn't matter if the foundation isn't solid. These children trust you, Caleb. That's not something you can fake. Will it be enough for the judge?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "Legally, you meet all the requirements. You've got land, income from occasional work, community support. The children are healthy, educated, safe." He paused. "But there's always politics.
Pressure from families who think they'd be better guardians. Prejudice against single men raising girls. So what do I do? Tell the truth. Show the judge what I've seen here. Show them a family that's healing." Harrison put his hand on Caleb's shoulder. "And have faith that doing the right thing matters." The night before they left for Laramie, Caleb couldn't sleep. He stood at the window watching the stars wheel overhead, trying not to think about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. "Mr. Rourke." He turned. Annie stood in her nightdress, pale in the moonlight filtering through the window. She'd never approached him alone before, always staying close to her sisters or Lydia. "Can't sleep either?" Caleb asked. Annie shook her head. She came to stand beside him at the window, so small the top of her head barely reached his belt. For a while they stood in silence, looking out at the night. Then Annie reached up and took Caleb's hand. Her fingers were tiny and warm, and they gripped his with surprising strength. Caleb looked down at her. In the pale light, her eyes were huge and solemn. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, Annie spoke. "Pa." One word, barely a whisper. But it shattered something in Caleb's chest and rebuilt it differently in the same moment. He knelt down, bringing himself to her level. "What did you say?" Annie's lips moved. At first, no sound came out. Then, with visible effort, she tried again. "Pa." Tears burned in Caleb's eyes. He pulled Annie into a hug, felt her small arms wrap around his neck, and let himself feel the full weight of what this meant. This child who hadn't spoken in months had chosen him as the first person to speak to, had chosen that word, that name, that impossible responsibility and gift. "I'm here," Caleb whispered into her hair. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Annie pressed her face against his shoulder. He felt her breath, warm and steady, and heard her voice, soft and uncertain but real. "Stay," she said. "Always," Caleb promised. "Always." They stayed like that until Annie fell asleep in his arms. Caleb carried her back to bed, tucked her in beside her sisters, and stood watching all 5 children sleep. Tomorrow they would go before a judge. Tomorrow everything could change. But tonight, for the first time in 6 years, Caleb Rourke had a daughter who called him Pa. And that was enough. The ride to Laramie took 2 days. Caleb drove the wagon Walter had loaned them, the children bundled in blankets against the cold. Cole rode alongside on his mare, and Maggie followed in her own buckboard loaded with supplies in case they had to stay longer than expected. The first night, they camped in a stand of cottonwoods beside a half-frozen creek. Caleb built a fire while Lydia organized the sleeping arrangements with military precision. The twins huddled together under a mountain of blankets. Evan helped Caleb tend the horses, moving carefully on his bad leg but refusing to complain. Annie stayed close to Caleb's side, and twice during the evening she spoke. Single words, tentative and soft, but words nonetheless. "Cold," she said when the wind picked up. "Hungry," she said when Lydia handed out jerky and hardtack. Each time, the other children stopped what they were doing to stare. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, she quickly blinked away. Even Noah, usually so contained, smiled. "She's coming back," Evan said quietly to Caleb while they checked the horse's hobbles. Like she was before." "People heal at their own pace," Caleb said. "Just takes the right circumstances." "And the right people," Caleb glanced at the boy. "You're getting philosophical in your old age." Evan almost smiled. "I'm 12. Ancient. That night, Caleb lay awake staring at the stars through the bare branches overhead. Tomorrow, they'd reach Laramie. Tomorrow, a judge would decide whether 5 children could stay with a man who'd spent 6 years forgetting how to be human. The weight of it pressed down on his chest until breathing felt like work. "You're doing it again," Lydia whispered from her bedroll. "Doing what?" "Thinking so loud it keeps everyone awake." "Can't help it. You could try." She shifted, propping herself up on one elbow. "What's the worst that could happen tomorrow?" The judge says no. You're all sent to an orphanage or split up between different families. And the best? The judge says yes, you stay. So either way, we find out. Either way, the waiting ends. Lydia lay back down. Seems to me that's better than not knowing. Caleb considered this. The girl was right, in her way. At least tomorrow would bring certainty, even if that certainty was something he didn't want to face. "When did you get so wise?" he asked. "When I didn't have a choice." The Laramie Courthouse was a 2-story building of red brick and white trim that looked wildly out of place among the rough wooden structures surrounding it. Caleb helped the children down from the wagon, noting how they stayed close together, forming an unconscious protective cluster. Cole had arrived earlier and stood waiting on the steps. "Judge Thorne's ready. He wants to see you and the children in chambers." "All of us?" "All of us. He said he wants to talk to each child individually, then see the family as a whole." Cole's expression was carefully neutral. "Caleb, I should tell you, there's been a complication." Caleb's stomach dropped. "What kind?" "A couple from Cheyenne. Name of Harrison. No relation to our doctor. They filed a petition to adopt the children. They're prominent, wealthy, connected. The wife is from a good family, and they've been trying to have children for years. So the judge will choose them over me. Not necessarily, but it means you'll have to make your case directly, show why you're the better option." Lydia gripped Caleb's hand. "We don't want them. We want to stay with you." "That's what you'll tell the judge," Cole said gently. "Come on, he's waiting." Judge Randall Thorne was older than Caleb expected, maybe 70, with white hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. His chambers were lined with law books and smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. He stood when they entered, gestured to chairs arranged in a semicircle. "Mr. Rourke, children. Reverend Cole, please sit." They sat. The children arranged themselves with Lydia and Evan flanking Caleb, the twins pressed against Lydia's side, Annie in Caleb's lap. Thorne settled behind his desk, steepled his fingers. "I've read the petitions. Both of them. I've reviewed Marshal Whitaker's report on the Vance case. I've read the character references submitted on Mr. Rourke's behalf." He paused. "And I've read the medical examinations Dr. Harrison conducted." "Your Honor," Cole began. Thorne held up a hand. "Let me finish, Reverend. I've been a territorial judge for 30 years. In that time, I've seen every variation of custody dispute you can imagine. Fights over money, over property, over revenge. Very rarely do I see fights over what's actually best for the children involved." He looked at Caleb. "Mr. Rourke, why do you want guardianship of these 5 children?" Caleb had prepared for this question, had rehearsed answers with Cole on the ride down. But faced with those piercing blue eyes, all the practiced words fled. "Because they need someone," he said finally. "And I need them. That's not much of a reason. It's the only one I have." Thorne's expression didn't change. "The Harrisons can provide these children with education, opportunity, social connections. They have a large home in Cheyenne, servants, money. What can you offer that compares to that?" Caleb looked down at Annie in his lap, at Lydia pressed against his side, at Evan watching him with barely contained hope. "Stability," Caleb said. "Someone who won't leave. Someone who knows what it's like to lose everything and keep going anyway." He met Thorne's eyes. "These children have been through hell. They don't need money or social connections. They need to feel safe. And you think you can provide that?" "I know I can. I already have been." Thorne nodded slowly. "I'd like to speak with the children now, individually. Mr. Rourke, you and Reverend Cole can wait outside." The next hour was agony. Caleb paced the hallway, while Cole sat calmly on a bench, reading through legal documents. One by one, the children disappeared into chambers and emerged looking shaken, but determined. Lydia came out first, her jaw set. He asked if I felt safe with you, if you'd ever hurt me or made me uncomfortable. What did you say? That you're the first adult since Ma and Pa died who made me feel like a person instead of a problem. Evan was next.
He wanted to know if I wanted to stay or if I just felt obligated. And I told him family isn't about blood. It's about who stands with you when everything's falling apart. The twins emerged together, Molly's eyes red from crying. He asked if we'd rather have a mother and father or just you, Noah reported. Molly told him you're both. Annie was last. She went in clutching Lydia's hand and came out alone, her face grave but calm.
When she saw Caleb, she ran to him and wrapped her arms around his leg. Pa, she said clearly, my pa. Finally, Thorne called them all back in. This time, another couple stood beside his desk. The Harrisons, Caleb assumed. The man was tall and well-dressed, the woman elegant in a way that made Caleb acutely aware of his worn coat and work-roughened hands. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison have offered to adopt all 5 children, Thorne said. They've promised to keep the siblings together, provide education, and maintain family bonds. He paused. They've made a compelling case. Mrs. Harrison stepped forward. Her smile was kind, her voice gentle. We know this must be difficult for all of you, but we can offer you opportunities Mr. Rourke simply cannot. Music lessons, proper schooling, introduction to society. You'd want for nothing. Except him, Lydia said flatly. Mrs. Harrison blinked. I'm sorry? We'd want for him. For our family. Lydia stood, faced the Harrisons directly. You seem like nice people. Rich people. But you're not our people. Young lady, you don't understand. I understand fine. You can't have children, so you want to buy ours. Package us up like we're dolls for you to dress and show off. Lydia's voice shook, but didn't break. We're not for sale. Not anymore. Lydia, Caleb said quietly. No. She turned to Thorne. Your Honor, I'm 12 years old enough to know my own mind, and I'm telling you, we choose Caleb. We choose the man who found us dying in a blizzard and brought us home, who taught Evan carpentry and taught me to shoot, who built us new rooms and gave us a life that's ours, not some fancy version of what rich people think we should be. Thorne's eyebrows had climbed steadily during this speech. That's quite a statement. It's the truth. And the rest of you? Do you agree with your sister? Evan stood. Yes, sir. The twins nodded in unison. Yes, Molly whispered. Annie looked up at Caleb, then at the judge. Pa, she said simply, as if that one word explained everything. Mrs. Harrison's face had gone pale. Your Honor, surely you can see these children have been influenced. What I see, Thorne interrupted, is 5 children who know exactly what they want. He looked at Mr. Harrison. I appreciate your offer, truly, but I can't in good conscience separate these children from the only stable home they've known in months, possibly longer. But the opportunities are meaningless if the foundation isn't solid, and from what I've seen, Mr. Rourke has built that foundation. Thorne turned to Caleb. However, there are conditions. Caleb's heart hammered. What conditions? First, you'll submit to quarterly reviews for the next 2 years. A territorial agent will visit your home, examine the children's living conditions and education, verify they're being properly cared for. Done. Second, you'll ensure all 5 children receive adequate schooling. I don't care if you hire a tutor or send them to town, but they will be educated. Yes, sir. Third, and this is non-negotiable, you'll accept help when you need it. From the Reverend, from your neighbors, from anyone offering legitimate support. These children need a community, not just one man. I understand. Thorne picked up a document, signed it with decisive strokes. Then by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, I hereby grant full legal guardianship of Lydia, Evan, Noah, Molly, and Annie Hale to Caleb Rourke, effective immediately. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Lydia made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob, and threw her arms around Caleb's neck. Evan grabbed his hand. The twins wrapped themselves around his legs. Annie pressed her face against his chest and said, Pa, over and over, like she was testing the permanence of the word. Caleb stood in the middle of the judge's chambers, surrounded by 5 children who were now legally his, and felt the last piece of ice around his heart finally melt. The Harrisons left quietly. Cole shook Caleb's hand with tears in his eyes. Thorne came around his desk and looked at the chaotic family in front of him. "You've taken on a hell of a responsibility," he said to Caleb. "I know. Those children are going to drive you crazy. Test your patience. Make you question every decision you make." "I expect so. Good luck, Mr. Rourke. You're going to need it." They stayed in Laramie that night at a boarding house Maggie recommended. The children shared one room, Caleb another, but none of them slept much. Through the thin walls, Caleb could hear excited whispers, occasional laughter, the sound of Annie's voice as she practiced speaking. In the morning, they started home. The journey back felt different, lighter somehow, despite nothing physical having changed. The children sang songs Lydia remembered from before their parents died. Evan told jokes that weren't particularly funny but made everyone laugh anyway. Even Noah, usually so quiet, joined in the conversations. Caleb drove the wagon and listened to the sound of family and wondered how he'd ever survived 6 years without it. They reached the cabin on the 3rd day. The addition stood half finished, but the walls were up and the roof was framed. It looked like possibility, like promise. "Home," Annie said softly, and the word carried weight beyond its size. That night, they celebrated. Maggie had left a package on the porch: fresh bread, butter, a jar of honey, and a note that read, "Welcome home, all of you." They ate until they were stuffed, and afterward Caleb brought out the harmonica he hadn't touched since Sarah died. He'd forgotten how to play, but his fingers remembered. The melody was simple, a folk song his mother had taught him as a child. Molly clapped along. Noah swayed. Evan tapped his good foot. Lydia smiled that tentative smile that made her look her actual age instead of twice it. Annie curled up in Caleb's lap and rested her head against his chest, her small hand over his heart. "Again," she said, when the song ended. So Caleb played again. And again. Until his lips were tired and the children were half asleep and the fire had burned down to coals. Winter deepened over the next weeks, but the cabin felt warmer than it ever had. Caleb and Evan finished the addition, working by lamplight when the days grew too short. The girls moved into one new room, Evan into the other, and suddenly the main cabin felt spacious instead of cramped. Lydia continued teaching the younger ones, supplementing with books Cole brought from town. Molly learned to read full sentences. Noah discovered she had a gift for arithmetic. Annie's vocabulary expanded daily, though she still spoke quietly, carefully, like words were precious things to be rationed. Evan's stutter improved when he wasn't stressed, and Caleb noticed the boy stood straighter now, carried himself with growing confidence. The limp would never fully disappear, but Evan had stopped apologizing for it. One evening in late February, nearly 2 months after the hearing, Caleb found Lydia sitting on the porch wrapped in blankets and staring at the stars. "Cold out here," he said, joining her. "I like the cold now. Reminds me we survived it." They sat in companionable silence. A wolf howled somewhere in the distant darkness. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. "I've been thinking," Lydia said eventually, "about changing our name." "To what?" "Rourke." She glanced at him. "I know we're not yours by blood, but we're yours in every other way that matters, and I want the same name. Want people to know we belong together." Caleb's throat tightened. "You don't have to do that." "I know, I want to." She paused. "The others want to as well. We talked about it." "All of them?" "Annie said it first, actually. Said she's Annie Rourke now, not Annie Hale. The rest of us agreed." Caleb looked out at the valley, at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Thought about names and belonging and the family he'd lost and the family he'd found. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. Lydia leaned against his shoulder. "Thank you for everything, for not riding past that day. Thank you for pointing a knife at my throat. Really made a good first impression." She laughed, and the sound was so unexpected and genuine that Caleb felt his own lips curve into a smile. Spring came slowly to the Wyoming mountains, but when it arrived, it transformed everything. The snow melted to reveal green underneath, Wildflowers erupted in patches of brilliant color. The creek ran full and fast with snowmelt. Caleb taught the children to fish, to recognize animal tracks, to understand the rhythms of the land they now called home. He showed Evan how to break a horse properly, with patience instead of force, taught Lydia to handle the rifle with enough confidence that she could put a bullet through a tin can at 50 yards, helped the twins plant a garden, turning over soil that had lain fallow for 6 years. Annie followed him everywhere, her constant shadow. She spoke more each day, full sentences now instead of single words. One morning, she looked up at him while they were collecting eggs from the chickens Maggie had insisted they needed. "Do you still miss them?" she asked. "Your other family?" Caleb stopped, an egg warm in his palm. "Every day." "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes, but differently than before." "How?" He looked down at her serious face, at eyes that knew more about loss than any 4-year-old should. "Before, it hurt because they were gone and I was alone. Now it hurts because I wish they could meet all of you, see what we've built." Annie thought about this. Then she took his hand. "Maybe they can see, from somewhere. Maybe. I think they'd be happy, that you're not alone anymore." Caleb squeezed her hand gently. "I think so too." In May, the first territorial agent came to conduct the court-mandated review. She was a stern woman named Catherine Morrison, who took notes on everything and asked pointed questions about education, nutrition, and moral development. She interviewed each child separately, examined their living quarters, reviewed the lesson plans Lydia had developed. At the end of the day, she sat across from Caleb at the kitchen table and reviewed her notes. "The children are healthy, well-fed, and demonstrably happy," she said. "Their education is progressing adequately. The living conditions are rustic but appropriate." She looked up. "However, I have concerns about the lack of female influence in the household. Growing girls need guidance from women, particularly regarding certain delicate matters." "I've arranged for Maggie Fletcher to visit twice a week," Caleb said. "She's been teaching Lydia and the twins cooking, sewing, and what she calls practical womanhood. And the Reverend's wife has agreed to provide religious instruction," Cole added. He'd insisted on being present for the review, claiming it was his pastoral duty. Morrison made a note. "That's acceptable. But Mr. Rourke, you should be aware that as these girls grow older, there will be increased scrutiny, particularly regarding propriety and reputation." "I'm aware." "Good." She closed her notebook. "My recommendation will be that guardianship continue without modification. The next review is scheduled for August." After she left, Caleb let out a breath he'd been holding for hours. Lydia, who'd been eavesdropping from the bedroom, emerged with the other children close behind. "We passed?" she asked. "We passed." The celebration that night was louder than the one after the hearing. Maggie had left a pie, actual pie, with real fruit filling, and they ate the whole thing in one sitting. Even Caleb, who normally avoided sweets, had 2 slices. Summer brought long days and warm nights. The garden flourished under the twins' careful attention. Evan helped Caleb repair the fence line and showed a natural aptitude for understanding animals. Lydia started writing, stories at first, then careful observations about their daily life. She showed them to Caleb one evening, her expression vulnerable in a way it rarely was anymore. "These are good," he said after reading through several pages. "Really good." "You're just saying that." "I'm not. You've got a gift for words. Ma used to say that. Said I should write things down so I wouldn't forget." "Your ma was right." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "I'm starting to forget what she looked like. Pa, too. Their faces are getting fuzzy." Caleb understood. He'd had the same experience with his own wife and daughter, their features becoming less distinct as the years passed. It felt like betrayal, even though he knew it was just the way memory worked. "Write down what you remember," he said. "The important parts, how they made you feel, what they taught you. Those things matter more than faces." "Will you tell me about yours? Your wife and daughter? Their names?" Caleb had avoided talking about them in detail, giving the children only the barest facts. But Lydia's question was honest and open, without any expectation beyond simple curiosity. "My wife was Ellen. She had red hair and freckles, and she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them." The words came easier than he'd expected. "Sarah, our daughter, was 6 when she died. She wanted to be a horse trainer, used to sleep in the stable with the foals. They sound wonderful. They were. I'm glad you had them, even though losing them hurt. Me too. By the time August arrived for the second review, the cabin had transformed. Curtains hung in the windows, sewn by Lydia from fabric Maggie had brought. The garden produced enough vegetables to feed them with surplus to trade in town. The children had responsibilities and routines, structure and purpose. They'd become a unit, functioning with the kind of easy coordination that only came from living together and learning each other's rhythms. The second review was shorter than the first. Morrison noted the improvements, asked fewer questions, seemed satisfied with the progress. Her report was brief and positive. The third review, in November, was almost perfunctory. By then, even Morrison had stopped looking for problems. The children were thriving in ways that couldn't be faked or hidden. They were a family, and everyone could see it. Winter returned, but this time Caleb was ready. He'd stocked enough food for 6 people, cut enough firewood to heat the expanded cabin, prepared in ways he never had when living alone. When the first snow fell, the children pressed their faces to the window and laughed instead of huddling in fear. "Remember last year?" Molly asked. "When we were in the wagon?" "Don't remind me," Lydia said, but she was smiling. "Seems like a long time ago," Evan added. "Feels like forever," Noah agreed. Annie was sitting in Caleb's lap, watching the snow accumulate. "We're safe now," she said. Not a question, a statement of fact. "Yes," Caleb confirmed. "We're safe." On Christmas morning, their first together, Caleb gave each child a small gift. Hand-carved animals for Annie, a new dress for each of the twins sewn with Maggie's help, books for Lydia, a proper set of woodworking tools for Evan. The children gave him things they'd made in secret, a quilt from Lydia and the twins, pieced together from fabric scraps, a carved picture frame from Evan, holding a drawing Annie had made of the whole family standing in front of the cabin. Caleb looked at the drawing, 6 figures rendered in a child's uncertain hand but unmistakably them, and felt his eyes burn with tears he didn't try to hide. "This is perfect," he said. "All of it." "You're crying," Molly pointed out. "Sometimes you cry when you're happy." "Are you happy?" Caleb pulled all 5 children close, felt their warmth and weight and absolute reality. "More than I ever thought I'd be again." The years that followed developed their own patterns and rhythms. The children grew. Lydia turned 13, then 14, then 15, becoming less like a child and more like a young woman with opinions and plans and a fierce intelligence that intimidated half the adults in Silver Creek. Evan shot up 6 inches in 1 year, his voice deepening, his stutter fading to almost nothing. The twins remained inseparable but developed distinct personalities. Molly, gregarious and social, Noah quiet and observant. Annie never stopped being Caleb's shadow, even as she grew into her own person. She had Ellen's laugh, Caleb realized one day. The same sudden brightness that transformed her whole face. The territorial reviews continued every 3 months for the full 2 years, then stopped. The guardianship was made permanent without ceremony or complication. The Rourke family was official in every legal sense, though they'd been real long before any court said so. Caleb built a proper schoolroom onto the cabin, hired a teacher from town to come 3 days a week, added a barn, expanded the garden, bought more livestock. The ranch, because it was a ranch now, not just a cabin in the mountains, became profitable enough to support 6 people with some left over. Walter Boone helped with the heavy work. Maggie continued her twice-weekly visits, bringing gossip and hard-won wisdom in equal measure. Cole performed a proper baptism for all 5 children, though Caleb suspected it was more about community than religion. On the 5th anniversary of finding the children in the snowstorm, Caleb stood on the porch and looked out at the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of his family. Lydia calling the twins in for dinner, Evan arguing with Noah about something inconsequential, Annie practicing a song on the harmonica Caleb had given her. 5 years. It felt like yesterday and like forever ago simultaneously. "Pa?" Annie appeared beside him, 17 now, and nearly as tall as Lydia. "You okay?" "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how much has changed." "Everything changed," Annie said. She leaned against the railing, looked out at the same view Caleb was watching. "We changed. You changed. Even this place changed. For the better, I hope. Definitely for the better. She paused. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Ash hadn't stopped that day? If you'd ridden past? Caleb had thought about it, more than once. Sometimes. I don't, Annie said firmly, because it didn't happen. You stopped. You saved us, and we saved you right back. She was right. That day in the blizzard, 5 children had needed saving, but Caleb had needed it just as much. They'd rescued each other, pulled each other back from different kinds of death, and built something neither could have managed alone. Come on, Annie said, tugging his arm. Dinner's ready, and you know how Lydia gets when the food goes cold. Caleb let himself be pulled inside into the warmth and noise and beautiful chaos of family. The table was crowded, the conversation loud, the food simple but plentiful. Lydia had made a roast with potatoes and carrots from their garden. Evan had baked bread that was slightly lopsided but tasted perfect. The twins argued about whose turn it was to wash dishes. Annie laughed at something Noah said, and the sound filled the whole cabin. Caleb sat at the head of the table and looked at each face in turn. 5 children who'd become 5 adults, though not all of them were grown yet. 5 lives he'd almost ridden past. 5 souls who'd taken his broken pieces and helped put them back together into something new. After dinner, they gathered around the fire like they had every night for 5 years. Lydia read aloud from a book of poetry. Evan worked on a carving. The twins played their string game. Annie curled up against Caleb's side, warm and solid and real. Tell us a story, Molly requested. About the old days. The old days, Caleb repeated. I'm only 42. Ancient, Noah said with a grin. So Caleb told them about the war, about traveling west, about meeting Ellen and building the original cabin. He told them about Sarah, about teaching her to ride, about the way she'd wanted to name every animal on the property. He told them about the fever, the grief, the 6 years of deliberately chosen isolation. And he told them about the day Ash refused to move, about finding a wagon in a blizzard, about 5 pairs of eyes staring at him from beneath inadequate blankets. I thought I was saving you, he said. Turns out, it was the other way around. It was both, Lydia said quietly. We saved each other. The fire crackled. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, gentle and soft. Through the window, Caleb could see it accumulating on the ground, on the barn roof, on the branches of the pines. Annie shifted against his side. Pa? Yes? I'm glad Ash stopped that day. Me too, sweetheart. And I'm glad you didn't ride past. So am I. Annie looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much darkness but had found their way back to light. I love you, she said simply. The words landed in Caleb's chest and took root there, solid and permanent and real. He wrapped his arm around his youngest daughter and looked at his other 4 children gathered around the fire, at the home they'd built together from nothing but need and determination and the willingness to try. I love you too, he said, all of you. And it was true, more true than anything else in his life had ever been. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentle and forgiving. Inside the cabin that had once held only ghosts and silence, a family lived and laughed and loved. 5 children who'd needed a father had found one. One man who'd needed a reason to keep living had found 5. They'd come together in a storm, broken and desperate and nearly destroyed. And they'd built something from the wreckage. Not perfect, nothing ever was, but real. Solid. Worth everything it had cost and more. Caleb Rourke had stopped for 5 frozen souls in a Wyoming blizzard, and in doing so, he'd saved his own. That was the end of the story. But it was also, in all the ways that mattered, just the beginning.